Hello, welcome to Red Solitary Series. My name is James Lucarelli, and today I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Jonathan Petz and Clay Reed. How you guys doing?
Yo,
Hi,
how's it going,
everyone.
James?
Well, we're all excited for our 17th episode today, and when we reached out and listened to the feedback from what you guys wanted to see next, we had an overwhelming demand for us to do an episode on ISO and black shade calibration. Now, when we started working on the script, we figured out that it was going to be too much to fit all in one episode. So for today, we're really going to focus in on understanding ISO and maybe hopefully having a better understanding for that for the next time we're out there on set. So right off the bat, let's go ahead and set the table for some of the things we're going to go ahead and talk about today. What is ISO? What is some of the differences between native and base ISO? How do these decisions impact our noise? What are some of the types of noise? Does ISO adjustments affect our dynamic range? How can we use these adjustments to have an overall cleaner image? What does dual ISO mean? Is this truly metadata? We're going to talk about all of this and how it impacts our images in post and our decisions in post. And really, I think at the end of this, one of the things you always have to keep in mind is having an exposure strategy and being able to control that balance within your camera. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a nice graphic to help illustrate that exposure strategy, or the exposure triangle as it's often called here. And there's really three main parameters that can control the amount of light that comes into your given shot: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, we all know that aperture is what's going to go ahead and control our depth of field. Essentially, a smaller f-stop is going to give more light to our scene and give us a shallower depth of field. And when we can do the inverse of that and stop down to maybe a higher f-stop number, our scene's going to be darker, our image is going to be darker, but we're going to have greater depth of field and more in focus. Shutter speed, or oftentimes it is tied with frame rate, and really what we're talking about here is integration time. Shutter is what's going to dictate how much motion blur you have, or if you're taking stills, how much you want something to stop. So really, frame and shutter is something that we use to control motion. Aperture is what we control depth of field. And ISO is also something that can control brightness, but ISO is the one that's going to go ahead, and as we brighten our image or raise our ISO, we're also going to impact more or introduce more noise into our shot. So a lower ISO is going to be a darker image, whereas a higher ISO is going to be an overall brighter image. Now, we're going to go ahead and look at all three of these things, but oftentimes when Johnny and Clay and myself show up on set, us being the operator, we don't get to dictate what aperture we shoot at or what frame rate or shutter we shoot at. And ISO, out of all of those three things, is the one where we are actually dealing with an amplification of the actual signal. So really, that is the one that we do have a little bit more flexibility with, and it allows us to do some really great things in post. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys here Red Cine X, and show you a couple images here where we're shooting either in a low light environment, high frame rate, and as you can go ahead and see this was captured at a 2000 ISO. Now, I can't go back and change the aperture, and I can't go back and change the frame rate, but what I am able to do is either bring that ISO from 2000 down to maybe something like 1000, bring that essentially down a stop, or increase that to something maybe like 2500 or 3200. Once again, this is not changing any of the metadata. This is still the same amount of physical photons that were captured in this scene. And you can see this is a great way that you can either darken your image or brighten your image. But once again, this is an amplification of the, ISO is typically an amplification of the signal. And really with RED, what we're able to do here is have highlight protection as well as shadow protection all within that same shot, and really allows us to have that ultimate flexibility. Now, I want to go ahead and open it up to my associates here in the stream as well, because this is definitely something that we are very much aware of and something that we're talking about here daily. So Clay and Johnny.
Yeah. What I love that you talked about is strategy, because it's really about balancing the characteristics that you want for your image with the exposure that it's actually going to accomplish it for post, right? So getting enough light on the sensor. And like you said, sometimes you can't choose that aperture or that shutter speed just because it's going to be based on the conditions of the shoot. But all of this should be condition dependent, should be scene dependent, right? When you make these choices, it shouldn't be arbitrarily at the beginning of a project. It should be based on the things you're trying to accomplish in a shot. And so I just think that that's like something we really should hit home, because it's those are the choices you make, because a wide open aperture looks smooth and creamy and I might want that, but that's going to let a ton of light in, and that might not work for how I want to expose my image. So I have to start looking at these other options for how I get to that place.
No, exactly. I mean, there's tons of tools that we actually have in camera that can allow you to find that balance. Find, am I going to retain highlight detail there when I want it? Am I going to get shadow detail there when I want it? And also the tools that we have monitor the image and give you a reference at different points in the imaging processing pipeline. And now, why is this important to ISO? Because the ISO is going to impact them all very, very differently, or some not at all. And we have three kind of categories of points that we can monitor at. We've got our raw meters. These are ones that are unimpacted by metadata changes. So changing our ISO, changing our LUT, changing our output tone map isn't going to impact these tools. The only thing that will impact these tools is going to be a physical light change, an ND, an iris, a frame rate change. That's the only thing that will change it. We then have our tools that are monitoring the log, so our histogram or our false color exposure mode, which is going to be impacted by the Kelvin, the tint, the ISO, or your exposure adjustment. We then have our output look, so our 709 or our SDI feed going off to live broadcast, or we have our false color video tool, and things like the LUT, the tone mapping, the highlight roll-off, the color space, and the gamma are all going to impact these as well. So if you're doing a live broadcast, that might be a tool that's very, very important to you to ensure you're not clipping, broadcast safe, getting the detail and the shadows where and when you want it. Now, we discuss all these tools, how they work on Ranger, DSMC2, and KOMODO in Menu Tactics Part 1. But we're just going to quickly summarize it just to show how the use of ISO can change that and how it impacts those tools. So I'm just going to do a little screen share here. We're just going to kind of talk through some of these. So this is just a shot outside of our window here at our London offices. And you'll see down here, we have our raw tools. So that's going to be our traffic lights, our goalposts. And when I press play here, this is our shot. And we're going to use the exposure view just to view the image. Now, this is key here. So we're seeing green coming up as our middle gray point. And this is going to be important later on when discussing how ISO works with middle gray. Now, what's going to happen here is I'm going to change the amount of light coming into the lens, and we're getting an overview on the lens with this meter saying we're getting clipping. We can see it down here with the raw tools saying, hey, we're getting some clipping here. There's no more information there. And vice versa, purple would be areas where you're potentially underexposed. So what I did there is I then stopped the lens down to ensure we're getting information there. Now, to go to the next tool, we then have the geoscope, one of my personal favorite tools, which is a fantastic tool to allow you to look at the raw sensor data and map different colors similar to the zone system to different points in the dynamic range from 1 to 16. And why this is great is, say we have a green screen, we have our actor 1 stop above mid-gray, we then want our green screen to be 2 stops above mid-gray. We can assign that to a color and very, very quickly build this exposure profile, which is really, really cool. We can understand our camera and our sensor and what's going on within the image. So if we want to have a certain threshold for noise, we can map to that point and ensure that we never go into that point, because everyone's threshold is very, very different to noise. Some like a little bit more grain, like Clay with the Gemini, whereas James maybe likes to keep it very, very clean on the helium. So we then have one more tool here, which is the video false color mode. And then we'll look at how ISO impacts these. So with the video false color mode, we get an overlay that will give us some IRE values. There's a list on the operations guide of what all the colors represent, but pink is Caucasian skin tone, green middle gray. And as we open up, this tool then goes yellow. So how is our ISO going to impact this, and why is it important in our monitoring decisions? Because it's going to impact that. So as I stop the lens down here, we're then going to make some ISO adjustments. So I've just stopped it down to ensure that there's no clipping in the 709 output if we were live or anything like that. So here we are, we're 800 ISO. We're going to turn on the tool, and we're now going to increase our ISO and watch what happens. So we've got the mid-gray point is going to change, and also our highlight point is going to be changing. But notice the raw tools are not changing at all. So the R3D is remaining unaffected by this, but our output on the 709 was. So now we're going to look at our exposure tool. So our exposure tool, which is monitoring the log, again, notice our middle gray point with the green there. As we shift our ISO, how that mid-gray point changes. And that's going to be important in a few moments' time when we come in and discuss this. So what we're really getting at here is, ISO is metadata. It's something that could be changed before recording or after recording. That's the benefit of the R3D. It doesn't affect your dynamic range. The camera is always capturing your full dynamic range dependent on the scene. Not every scene is always 16 stops. It doesn't influence the R3D file. But what it will influence is your monitoring decisions. It's going to influence your histogram and how you decide to expose your scene. So as Clay was saying, it should really be scene and contrast dependent, your ISO. So
exactly. Because the strategy is what's so important, right? It's not just that you're exposing for right now what you're looking at in the monitor. We want to expose for the most information in post, and a lot of the time it's about putting your monitoring path in a place where you're enabling yourself to make decisions that are better for the long run.
No, exactly. And I mean, when we're increasing the ISO, what are we seeing along with that? We're seeing the introduction of noise. And this is interference in the signal coming from the photosites. And this can come from a variety of sources. So we can get noise from the electronic circuits connected to the sensor, thermal noise, variations in the number of photons detected. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And all analog circuitry will impart some noise into an image. And what I'm really getting at is that there's not one specific thing that will introduce noise into your image. And generally, these will manifest themselves as a few different types of noise as well. So there's fixed pattern noise, which we have a fantastic tool to map out that kind of noise, and we'll discuss in the black shading session in a couple of weeks. We have shot noise, which is random variation in the photon count hitting the pixel. We don't tend to see this kind of noise, and typically, as filmmakers, when we're referring to a noisy image, we're referring to read noise. You can think of this as a small cost of reading a pixel value. It's a constant cost for reading that pixel, and it makes up a greater and greater percentage of a signal in its darkest values. So if you're shooting in a very low light situation, the relative inherent cost of reading that pixel will be more prevalent in your image, which is why when we're in a very, very bright situation, the relative cost of reading that pixel isn't going to impact us as much. And as filmmakers, we all judge the abilities of a camera to boost its ISO and get us out of a tight space, or retain really low noise levels in low light environments and capture detail in there. And this is where the question comes up of, hey guys, what's the base ISO of your camera? The very, very common question that we get. And really, this stems from DSLRs that shot raw video, and they used a combination of gain types in their ISO to achieve that. So you would have native ISOs which had the 12 stops of dynamic range that the camera touted, and you had these in-between ISOs. So you had, for example, ISO 640, which used the analog gain of ISO 400, but with some digital gain to boost that image signal to get a brighter image, and these suffered in dynamic range. So really, even though these DSLRs were shooting raw video, you were baking in the amplification. You didn't have the benefit, as James just showed, to come in and change it after the fact. And where this is different is with RED, the original signal is remaining unamplified, it's unaffected. So what we define it as is a starting point, because the starting point is going to influence your exposure decisions. Am I shooting to protect highlight information, or am I shooting to get really fantastic, milky black, deep blacks, and low noise images? And what we're doing when we're changing that ISO is we're changing the distribution of those code values. So as I shift my ISO up, I'm shifting my code values and my mid-gray point to give me more highlight protection. So somebody may shift and have their starting point a little bit lower. And the reason why we say 800 is our starting point is it gives filmmakers a good basis to build their exposure off for retaining good highlight protection and good shadow protection as well. So let's start to look at some examples of this and try to really get it in a contextual sense. So the numbers in this diagram are purely hypothetical here, so just for the illustration of what's really going on. So let's say we have a scene where we have an actor sat by a window, and we've got our light on 100%, it's an overcast day, our lens is wide open anyway, and suddenly the sun comes out, and we are now clipping in the background. There's nothing we can do. If we want to stop the lens down, we're going to change the brightness level on our actor. So what can we do? We can change the distribution of those code values. So 800 ISO will be having a hypothetical middle gray point of around 512. But we want 2 more stops of highlight protection. So how are we going to achieve that? Because just changing the ISO won't do that, because we're just going to get a brighter image. So ISO 3200, 2 stops brighter, and then add 2 stops of ND. And you can see on the right-hand side that the distribution of those code values has now changed. And we've got 2 more stops of highlight protection. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have Clay talk through an example that he shot as a bit of a practical example of this. So I'm just going to get up my screen here, and Clay can kind of talk through going through this.
So for me, I didn't have a 0.6 with me, so I went for 3 stops. I went between 400 and 3200, and we added a 0.9 ND in between. And the idea being that we can get the same look on what our display path is. It looks pretty similar. There's some blowout on the skins, but I wanted this sort of dreamy feel for a musician friend of mine for a music video. And so as you can see in 3200, pretty much the same thing, but I've actually ND'd and used a higher ISO, meaning that I'm protecting the highlight details in his skin itself. And I believe next on here, Johnny's going to show us when we actually drop those values down, you can see when I'm in 400 with no ND, achieving the same look, I'm losing tons of stuff on the skin of the face. I'm just like really blowing out chunks. And then when you go to the next one, you see that, man, all that detail is there. And I shot a higher ISO. And because of the great amount of available light, we're not getting noise introduced to the image. We're actually just protecting those highlight details while achieving the exposure we wanted from a storytelling perspective.
I mean, yeah, exactly. It's all about having that strategy, knowing what you want and when you want it. Because like you said, in this situation, you're not looking for shadow detail. It's all a very bright scene, and it works vice versa. If you want shadow detail, you can shift your ISO down, and that will make you, or it'll force you into an exposure decision to open up that lens. So going back to our example a few moments ago of the window, here's an example of that. So I've got my face exposed to where I wanted it, and the sun's come out in the background. This is clipped. You can see here, the window behind me, these areas are completely gone. There's no detail there. I can't bring my light up anymore. It's at 100% max. If I stop my lens down, the exposure on myself is going to go down as well. Everything will come down in unison. So we can go to ISO 3200, 3 stops of ND, so the relative light levels are still matched. And what we can do is when we come into post and bring those shots down, we can now mask around me and then bring that down and then look like we got the perfect exposure when we're on set. So you can see here, completely clipped. All of this area is gone. There's no detail on the windows. The person, as they walked past, they were clipped as well. And then when we go over into 3200, we can see that all of these details are still remaining. So we can then do a key mask around myself and save myself in this situation where I wasn't able to control the exposure how I wanted to. So it's a tool that you can use to your advantage in tricky situations.
Yeah, this way of thinking is a huge thing to work on if you're into opening up your aperture. If you're really looking for that shallow depth of field look, it's important that you know how to strategize to maintain those highlight details.
And I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that triangle and mention, this is a hyper triangle because we've now introduced ND, and that's what's going to allow you to have that depth of field that you want. But I do want to point out in every one of those examples, if you did this based off of how you may have did this with another camera, this might seem counterintuitive, right? Shooting at a higher ISO, and when we are out on set, we do have this strategy, we have done this testing, and we have seen this result. So just know, not every camera works the same, but we are having this strategy because we have seen this overall cleaner image.
Yeah, same thing in the darks. If you're in a situation where you're going to be worried about how your low light's going to look and you're interested in retaining those details, I suggest to people that you actually rate the camera lower. So drop down that ISO so it forces you into decisions like opening up the lens more, grabbing that extra light, or bouncing some diffused light into a space. Any of those things are going to help you with a better final image for post while still executing your vision as you see it.
I mean, both of us here probably all rate the camera different for what we're doing. I know James, obviously out there in sunny California, if you're shooting surfing, you've got specular highlights, rating it at 1280 or 1600, getting a bit of ND on, or stopping the lens down a bit to give you an easier time to focus is going to help. But Clay, I know, loves shooting in low light, so rating it a little bit lower, forcing him into that is going to come along with that, and having a different starting point. So you can kind of think of it as every ISO is the native ISO, and it's just choosing that exposure decision. But there is always an exception to the rule, and that is with the Gemini sensor, which James is going to start talking about now.
Oh, and the Gemini sensor, once again, we've been talking about doing physical changes, right? Opening the aperture, removing ND, changing proximity to light. Everything we've talked about has been the same amount of photons hitting the sensor. Well, Gemini sensor is the one sensor that allows for dual sensitivity, and it actually allows us to take those same amount of photons and redistribute them and process them in a different way. Now, we aren't going to be able to talk about some of the inner workings of what's actually happening here, but it is a physical decision that is made on the capture stage, and I know Clay's got some great examples here that he can bring up. But when your back's up against the wall and our lens is all the way wide open and we can't come off of that frame rate or shutter because it's dictated from the last show or the previous creation, this is a very flexible tool that allows us to, get some incredible shots here. So I know Clay has them queued up here and we're gonna go ahead and see them. But the main thing to think about here is that 800 is the standard starting point for standard mode. And then when we go into low light mode, it's 3200. So that is the new starting point, effectively shifting your dynamic range 2 stops down to protect your shadows. And the inverse of that, right, we're gonna clip our highlights and you're gonna see that right here.
Yeah, so as we're looking at right here, this is me doing this shot at 800 in standard mode, and for me it's a little bit under. And still, because of this extreme difference, there's probably parts in the very center of the fire that I'm not gonna quite get detail that I was thinking of. So what I would actually do in this scenario is bump up to low light mode and base at 3200 where that starts, and here we can see much more detail in the shadows of my hand, and we're still getting pretty close to the same on the fire. We were always gonna lose little bits of the inside of that. And you can see we've got great detail and not a lot of noise in this area. It's just a really easy way to think about why you would want to switch. And the other thing we can talk about is why you might want to look at the crossover point, right? So right here, we're going to look, and this is in low light mode. And what you're going to see is that it's beautifully rendered the shadow details here. I love it. There's not a lot of noise or anything, but we're really losing little chunks of the candle and the flame is really crazy bright to my eye. So now let's see what that same 1600 in standard mode looks like. Now we can see that we are getting a little bit better on the flames. I can kind of see the wick under here where I couldn't before. It was just totally blasted. But we are starting to introduce noise in some of these darker areas over here. So it's really at that point that you can sort of decide, right, what's more important to you? Is it more important that you have, these highlight details retained, or is it more important that the shadows really sing with a lot of their detail properties? Once again, it comes back to your scene and your creative choices and the storytelling behind them.
It's one of those things that, throughout my time in the industry, people will just set one ISO for the entire job. And it's kind of hamstringing you in certain degrees, being able to have that flexibility, even on a camera that doesn't have a dual sensitivity, it's still going to benefit you as Clay's talked about there. I mean, we've got one more example just to kind of help illustrate this a little bit and kind of looking at the exposure tools as to what's going on. So here we have a shot looking at a camera, and we're going to look at it in low light mode as well. We can see the histogram all the way to the left, and our raw guides are telling us, hey, there is a quite large amount of underexposure going on in this shot. So as you can see, we're overlaying it. We can see a lot of purple here. That's where we're a lot of noise, no detail, and for this shot, not ideal. My lens, you can see here, is open at T1.5. There's nothing more I can do to get light into the shot. So by going into this dual sensitivity mode, fundamentally changing how the sensor's capturing light, we can then instantly see the change. We've now got no more of this bar being filled up. The histogram has shifted. And when I turn it back on again, we can see none of that is there in the background. And just to help illustrate Clay's point about the highlights, I did a shot pointing out the window again as well. So, we actually got a side-by-side shot. So there, you can see the difference in changing that, and nothing else changed there. There's no extra lights, no extra lens changes, frame rates. That was just changing between the dual sensitivity modes. And when we come here into the next shot in a few seconds, this is a bright environment. So you can see we're getting some clipping here. As these people walk across the street, you see clipping over here on the right-hand side, and you can see here we're in low light mode. When we flip back into the standard mode, that's the only thing that's changing, nothing else. When it loads back up again, we can see no more clipping on the highlights there. And when I bring up my exposure tool again, no more clipping over there. And this should be noted that this is a physical change. This isn't something that then in Red CineX you can flip back between. It is a hard switch between them. When you're in low light mode or standard mode, you can still move the ISO around, but it is a physical switch and a decision you've really got to be sure when you're making it.
And that's where I may lean on someone like Clay or Graham that really like the look of low light mode. Like right now, I'm inside in a relatively low light environment with 2 lights, but if I kill these lights and walk outside, it may be something where I like the look of low light mode inside, but I'll have some ND ready, because as soon as we go outside, I'm either going to want to drop that ND or introduce that, because I don't want to make that hard shift in the middle of my shot. You're not going to be able to. You would have to stop the shot. And then, once again, you're changing how that's being captured. So it's definitely something where you can have that conversation beforehand. And really, as a shooter, I like having an extra tool in my bag, right? When that last example there, you didn't come off of your aperture, you didn't change your ND, you didn't change any of your things that you needed for that shot. That's really nice to have that extra flexibility.
Yeah, and as a creative, I like how it just always circles back into like, what are you trying to achieve? What are your goals? What is your creative vision? Because for my 2 cents, I love that first shot of the camera that Johnny did in standard mode. Like, that's how I'd love, like, it's really punchy and dramatic and moody and mysterious, and like all of those things are things that I love to put into the product photography at RED. And so I might make the decision that screw those shadows, right? Like, let's crush them. Let's make this like a dark, ominous feature. But then the person next to me might be like really interested in the shapes of the camera and the details of the finish and all of that stuff underneath those shadows that I'm tending to crush, right? So I think it all comes back to like you as the creator and what you want to do and the strategies you choose to show off that vision.
Definitely. Actually, I've just seen some questions coming in, and Graham has been handling loads of these questions. So thank you so much, Graham. I've just seen one question come up here from Huey here, asking, should we all change the ISO in camera, or should we do it in post? And this is kind of the balance of what we've been discussing. You can change the ISO at any point. You can change it in camera when you're shooting or after the fact. But simply doing that, it won't give you that highlight protection. It's got to be done in tandem with an exposure change. So if you want to protect your highlights a bit more, you should be doing it in camera at the time of shooting with an ND change or an ND removal. In post, you'll get the benefit of being able to move the ISO, drop it down a stop, or increase the brightness. But getting that protection in the highlights or the shadows has to be done at the time of recording.
Mm-hmm. And this is where your traffic lights and your histogram really come into play. I do rate the sensor a little bit higher, right? I like that 1280, and one of the favorite things I like to do is just being able to show someone if they are contesting me, right? Maybe just bring it down to 800, right? Or just show someone real quickly that I do have a little bit of latitude there, right? I can't change the aperture. I can't change the frame rate or the shutter. That is something where I like to have that little bit of flexibility. Now that's don't shoot 12,800 and maybe don't shoot 250. And that's where I would encourage you to go out and do your own testing as well.
Yeah, I keep glancing over at what Graham's saying, and I love it because it's like, I really do follow this. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, that's just crazy. Nobody has time to really do that. And I genuinely, if I'm going into a scenario where I think I might worry about low light, I crank my ISO down to like 500 if I can. If I'm going into a situation where I know I have tons of extra light, I'm cranking up to 32 and then basing all my other decisions off of that baseline on my monitor. So, oh man, it's bright now. I better put some extra ND in there. Well, that's a good decision for my data in the end. And same on the dark side. Oh, it's dark. I better open up more. I better pump more light. All of those things are decisions that are going to benefit me in post.
Think about film stocks, right? You wouldn't go and treat one film stock like you would always treat every other one, right? You're going to do it based off of the characteristics of that film stock, right? You're going to go out and do your own testing. And really, there's no one thing that works for every situation, right? There just unfortunately isn't. So,
I mean, and that's kind of why we have it as a starting point. You know, that's why we don't refer to it as, hey, this is the native. Because I think when we see native, it's like, that's what I should be sticking to all the time, because that will give me the most dynamic range. But it helps you start your exposure. If you find you're losing a little bit on either side, you can shift that ISO, and you should be shifting that ISO to kind of compensate for that. I think this leads us into a nice point to open up for a bit more Q&A. Obviously, I think Graham has been handling all of the questions, but if there's any other questions, feel free to kind of fire them forward, and we can try and answer them here. Give the chat a moment.
It's cool. I hear tons of confusion about this stuff, and it's always like I get complacent, I guess. I forget that not everybody has Graham Natras that they can reach out to. Although I feel like if you go on Facebook and that stuff, you can, right? But it's just such a great resource to have.
Well, and back to the starting points, I'm sure Clay and Johnny, you have your starting points, right? You have your go-tos, right? We already said my outside daylight sunny's 1280. Right now, I'm shooting with my Gemini interior mix light, and that's 400 standard. So I actually started at 640, and I found that I like 400. So once again, I don't have the same starting point, but I do have a couple that are my go-tos, and I'm sure you guys have some as well.
So here we have a question. Coming up here. So if I shoot on low light on the Komodo, night, low light indoor interior scene, is it recommended that I bring the ISO down to 400 for the shadows? Clay?
I would say that you should bring it lower than you were originally planning, maybe, but 400 is pretty low. So that's going to make you compensate pretty heavily. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to, and I'm sorry to hit it so many times, but it's a really about creativity, right? So if that is changing the way that you're lighting the scene and ruining the vision that you had, then by all means, I say rate it where it's effective. But that's kind of we're just giving you a baseline to start looking at these ideas.
Well, the thing is, though, it's also dependent on your tolerance for noise as well.
Right.
In our session where we talked about the Gemini sensor, all the different sensors, Gemini has this really nice, noise characteristic where it feels a little bit film-like. So in testing, you can find out what your tolerance is to noise. Some people have a much lower tolerance and they don't want any at all, so they will flood the sensor with light. Others don't mind it. They feel it gives a little bit of texture and they love the look of it, so they don't mind rating it and starting at 800. So it's definitely something through, testing and experimenting to find out where that kind of lies for you. And especially on DSMC2 and Ranger, using that geoscope to find out where it is and giving yourself a little flag so that when you get into those darker areas, you've got a little thing that say, hey, you're getting into that darker area. Maybe you don't consider going so low or get some more light into the scene.
Yeah,
I love. Go ahead.
Go, James. Go, James.
I was going to say geoscope. I think we're both going to say how much we love it. But right now, as I move my head, right, there's a very challenging, I'm dancing right on that edge of that pool. And if I was to flip over to geoscope, I can reassure my colorist that, no, that information is still there. I'm 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops away. And really, that is where it's not a guess anymore. I can emphatically say, no, that is still there. So that was going to be my one point.
Yeah, and I was just saying that I love when people chime in on things that I actually like, strategies that I enjoy as well, which somebody said, should I just expose as far to the right as I can until I'm almost clipping? And I think, to be honest, it sounds crazy, right? But that's actually not a terrible strategy. If the way the light is playing in your scene is to your liking, a movie I love to bring up is Prometheus, right? They lit more so you can see the details in the backgrounds of those ships that are so intricate and intense, but the actual DI, the finish of the movie, was very dark and moody. And so they've lit it so that they can pull out those details when you want to see them, and it's all about the data. And so I do think that that's exposing to the right and making sure you don't clip isn't a bad strategy as long as the character of the light is how you want it to look.
I mean, this is the thing, as we've been saying, depending on how you want to shoot, if racking that light up to 100% is going to change the environment, it's going to change the mood, how surfaces are reflecting, that's going to have potentially a negative creative impact. Although it will give you great flexibility in post, that's not always what we want from the scene. Maybe we want a moody area in the scene because we're going to put a little hint to the viewer in this murder mystery that there's a knife hidden there. If we rack the light right up, that knife that we've hidden is going to start sheening and shining and it'll give it away. So yes, technically speaking, giving the sensor as much detail and light as possible will technically be good, but creatively it may not also. So it's about building this exposure strategy again. Just reiterating on that point.
Johnny's point about reading, right? Reading, and getting actual read noise, right? It's a low cost, but if you had a low capture, that cost is going to be much more apparent. If you fed your sensor some light and there's more light for there to work with, right? That's going to be less apparent. So I think when we talk about exposures, none of the definitions say do the least amount of things that I don't have to touch it in post. No, it's do what's scene dependent that gives you the most amount of highlight protection, but also keeping that texture in the shadows.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, ISO being metadata only applies if you're working with R3Ds, right? So all of these exposure decisions, if you're shooting ProRes, you're going to want to make sure you think about them and make them and use the tools that Johnny was showing before you actually finish your scene or shoot your scene, because you are baking in values at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just saw a question, is this all the same for Komodo? Yes, this is, because the Komodo shoots Red Code RAW the same as its bigger brothers on Ranger and DSMC2. Just obviously, as Clay said, with ProRes, slight differences there.
And I know that last question previously was asking about shooting in low light scenarios with the Komodo, not low light mode with Komodo. Gemini is the only sensor that does offer that dual sensitivity, but however, Komodo offers a global shutter. So back to film stocks, right? There are going to be reasons where different scenes will call for a different particular red sensor.
So here's a good question. So is the noise of the ISO the same on 3200 if I bring it down to 800 in post? Now, this is relative to your point at which you've exposed. If at 3200, you've done that to protect highlights, there's potential you may be making your shadows a bit noisier. You know, the sensor will capture as much information that is there at that point. You know, an ISO won't change the raw data. You can change the interpretation of it. So if at 3200, you're finding that, you know, there's a little bit too much noise in there and you want it a bit darker, going to 800 in post, it will darken the image. So it may, you know, make some of that noise less prevalent in the image, which is the benefit of this Red Code RAW codec, where, you know, if something is a little bit too noisy, actually I'm going to bring the ISO down and kind of change the amplification of the image. So using everything we've learned today, hopefully that can kind of help in that decision.
And I just pulled up Johnny's graphic there, right, where we were showing the difference between the 800 and the 3200. But once again, there was a physical change that was able to keep that scene being the same level of brightness. So I want to make this clear that it's not just making an ISO decision to try and get cleaner. It's pairing that with a physical exposure decision. So yes, that's the key thing that I wanted to bring up there. It's not just going to be, you know, because remember, ISO is metadata. Yeah. And I think we're doing good on timing. We're right around 40 minutes. Do you guys have any other key points or any questions you see that we want to address?
Seeing a few of the same ones I think we've answered.
Right.
So we go from Hoy. Is the noise level dependent on the amount of lux that you feed the sensor? So yes, so as we discussed, there is a read noise that you can have. There is a cost to reading the pixel. So if you're feeding the camera a very, very low amount of light, the relative amount that read noise will impact will be relatively greater, and it may impact it a bit more. So the less you feed the sensor and the more you ramp up the amplification, the more prevalent you'll get noise. Whereas if you feed the sensor loads of light and your ISO is still, you know, mine's currently at 1600, there is going to be less noise because the signal is going to be greater than the cost of reading the pixel, basically.
Great question. And we understand why there's a lot of questions, right? Because this is very counterintuitive. This is not how other cameras work, but it is something that once you have the understanding, I think the fun thing is you're going to understand how to use that flexibility. And this is going to help those challenging time-lapse shots, or that interview in the bathroom that's really, we'd love to feed more light, but we're going to have to move forward with it, right? It's just that it's going to be that extra tool in your bag, and having that better understanding is going to have better, cleaner images.
I've got a question here for you, Clay, when I found it. Here we go.
The below 400?
In your experience, what is the highest that you felt comfortable going to with Komodo?
It's so light dependent. Once again, we all keep coming back to like it's scene and strategy dependent, right? So as you saw with that other clip, I mean, you can shoot Komodo at 3200 if there's tons of light, and if that's in your strategy to protect your highlight roll off, that's totally doable. I think that it relates in the same way to a question I was going to try to tackle that kind of Graham beat me to. Is they were saying, oh, well, you said 400 is pretty low. Is that too low? And it's like, no. Anything you do creatively, as long as you're gathering all the data and making sure you're not clipping on one side or the other, it's really your ball game to play. You make the rules, man. Like you can do any of these things. It's really just about fulfilling your creative vision. But from a technical standpoint, there are things like you were saying with noise introduction. You're really going to want to balance your ISO choice with what that means for your image data, and then light accordingly, right? So if you are at 400 and you want to protect those shadows, you just have to know that you're going to have to pump more light in, or you're going to have to use Zack Snyder's special 0.0595 lens or something like that, right? Like you're going to have to do those things to compensate. And in the same world on Komodo, right? So if you want to be up at 3200 and you want to maintain low noise, then you're going to want to make sure you have enough light that 3200 isn't being starved for that cost.
I mean, also one of the things here is important is, you know, Red Code RAW, there's no sharpening, there's no noise reduction going on, where other cameras will introduce and do some of that for you. So out of the box, they look nicer, but it really restricts you in that ability to play and customize the image to your preference. So if you have shot, potentially at 1600, 3200, because you just wanted to boost the brightness levels and it's a little bit dark, when you get into post, you've still got all that flexibility to come in and do a little bit of noise reduction as and when you want, because we haven't done that for you. You've still got that flexibility to do it when you want, because a lot of the time, noise reduction will soften the image a little bit. And we want to give you as raw of an image as possible, so you have the control over your image, over that creativity.
Mm-hmm. And testing is another thing we should just hit home. It's like, if you really want to know, test it. If you want to know how it compares to a different camera, test it. If you want to know how it compares to itself in a different scenario, test it. Right?
It's actually one of the things that people take away from this is I'm going to go try some of these things. When I first started learning about this and doing testing for this, I was like, I'm going to really push this. Can I have a 3 stops difference and bring it back? In that window example, it was really fun going out there and seeing it for yourself. Obviously, we're kind of showing you examples here, but I really say go out and test it. Go out and boost that ISO, add some ND, or drop the ISO, open that iris, and really see the differences for yourself.
Yeah, somebody asked about time lapse, and I just wanted to say that I love wide open time lapses at 1 frame per second. And if you're like me and you like that as well, go pick yourself up a 2.7 ND. I have a Tiffin one. It cuts the light, let me tell you, like welding goggles, but it allows you to compensate for that great amount of light that you're letting into the sensor. So if I'm doing daytime time lapses, things like that, I'll just ND real heavily so that I can maintain those light trails and that longer exposure look.
Here's one that I brought up. This is also on Gemini. Notice it's 3200 low light here. And notice when we're talking time lapse, these are challenging shots. This is from day to night. But notice that even though we're here in low light, I'm at my starting point of 3200. I can still make that darker. I can still make that brighter. And once again, I think that's where when we are shooting time lapses, you can start to have that conversation of what's going to happen with the light. Is it going to continue to get darker? Okay, we know what's going to happen here. And look at this. This is me going out and doing testing at 12,800. I don't recommend doing this, but once again, I can make that darker in post. This is probably one where I probably should have started that on the other side. So just definitely going back to that point of we went out and not all of these were makes, right? I had to go out, find that out for myself. And yeah, that's why the next one wasn't at 12,800. It was starting to be back closer to that starting point. So I would have highlight and low light protection.
Just saw a question here from Matt, which Graham has just answered. He is beating us through this. What about chroma noise reduction in Red Cine X? As Graham has said, I love it. Leave it on. There's no downside to having it on. It's only going to help you in those areas. Same with the flashing pixel adjustment as well. I always leave it on. There's no real negatives. Obviously, some fringe cases potentially, but most of the time, leaving all these awesome tools on that we brought into the new SDK, and they're now in Resolve as well, so you can go get that chroma noise reduction on.
If you are doing it on a laptop or something that quite can't handle the full debayer, you might not notice this. So I remember toggling it on and off, and if you were at 1/8, 1/4, you're not going to see this. This maybe at half, but definitely full debayer if you want to actually see some of these, the chroma noise reduction and the flashing pixel. You will have to be at full premium. If you another very highly exciting topic here for us at RED. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We're hopeful that we all can get back out there on set, shoot respectfully, shoot healthily, and continue to go out and shoot some stuff. Thank you all for tuning in.
Also, thanks to Graham.
Yeah,
thanks so much, Graham. Graham, thank you so much.
See you soon, everyone.